to you by WDSR, Duquesne Student Radio.
This is also the first episode of the Student Discussion Series, where we talk to students with relevant experience on relevant topics.
Joining us now, our first Student Discussion Series guest is a man who founded the literary magazine The Robinson Post for his high school. A man who was named High School Model United Nations Delegate of the Year. A man who in one sitting ate 32 Krispy Kreme donuts. Ladies and gentlemen, coming to you all the way from Puerto Rico to the basement of College Hall without having played a single set of tennis in his life. Ladies and gentlemen, Rafael Nadal.
Thank you so much for the intro.
Yeah, it's not that one Rafael Nadal that all you guys are thinking of, as we said.
No, he's better.
Better, way better. Yeah, I'm the original one, actually. That's just he stole my name.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
It just happens, you know.
As we alluded to earlier, Rafael is from Puerto Rico.
Yes.
This is his second semester at Duquesne, and we brought him on to talk about some issues. I mean, Puerto Rico's been in the news a lot lately, hasn't it?
Yeah, for sure. Especially with the hurricane, the earthquake, all the issues with corruption. It's been getting rough, man. Definitely.
Yeah, there is a lot of talk now about whether or not Puerto Rico should be a state, and that's been a long time issue, but it's starting to collect steam now that it's been in the news more recently, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit today. We're going to be talking about the possibility, because it does seem to be a very real possibility, maybe in the next 5, 10, 15 years, that Puerto Rico, or perhaps another territory, and perhaps maybe DC, is granted statehood.
Yeah.
And it's an issue worth talking about because, I mean, this changes the electoral map a lot, and it changes how, it changes how we think of people, and so it's an issue that demands our time, our discussion, our thoughts. So I guess just to sort of get started here, Puerto Rico's been a U.S. territory for a long, long time, and how do people living in Puerto Rico right now feel about the prospect of becoming a fully fledged U.S. state?
Well, that's actually very controversial. A lot of Puerto Ricans don't even know where they stand in this issue, because it's a very, very multifaceted question. Like, putting your culture beside economics, it's extremely complex. But at the same time, there was a recent referendum in 2013 that said that 66% of Puerto Ricans actually want to become a state. And our representative in the House, Pedro Pierluisi, he pulled it up into one of the committees, but it just died in committee. So
because if you look at the people living in the mainland of the United States, if 66% of us agree on something, except for gun control, it generally gets done.
Yeah, and the other thing that's special about Puerto Rico and DC, and I don't know if Guam even has it, is that they have a representative in Congress. They just can't vote, which is stupid. Because
isn't that the exact same thing that back in the day the American colonies used to complain about, that they had a representative in British Parliament but couldn't vote? So
literally, it's the same thing.
Interesting.
DC, Washington DC, all their license plate on them say taxation without representation, which the last thing you think from the most liberal place in America is to use the libertarian catchphrase that got America its independence, but
Right. Yeah. Yeah, in Puerto Rico, it's the same thing. Election day, people are waving their American flags and waving their Puerto Rican flags. And you can immediately tell who's in which party, which is, I think it's not correct, because we can become a state all while preserving our culture. I'm a fond believer in that. I obviously think that, policy does have an impact. And if we do become a state, we're going to be more Americanized. But that's the true controversy. People in Puerto Rico, they're framing it as if we become a state, we sacrifice our culture.
Interesting.
And it's just not true.
So that is something that people are legitimately afraid of then?
Oh yeah. Over this break, I read a book called about Puerto Rican identity by this film producer called Roberto Pereira, and he discussed this a lot. He talked about how if you want to become a state, you are being disrespectful towards Puerto Rico's culture, and I just don't believe that. It's getting to this point where it's just it's getting equally as polarized, like in the U.S. with just current events. It's getting the same thing with Puerto Rico.
It's like they're very similar places.
And
Interesting.
Look at Texas. How culturally completely different Texas is. Utah, Massachusetts. They're all so different than like the rest of the United States. And every state has its own, distinguishing qualities. Obviously, not as much as Puerto Rico, but like Texas is basically its own country. It has all of its own culture.
I mean, if you want to compare it to Europe, I mean, we have the Switzerland of the United States, Florida, or Connecticut, depending on if you want to talk about it as a tax haven or not. But that's really interesting because I thought, I mean, after seeing I think it's fair to call it a debacle. I mean, in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, right?
Yeah.
See, this is another problem, and this is why we should talk about it because I don't really even know what's going on that well. Like, I'm not sure of myself.
So many things, but it all falls down into the bureaucracy. Like, I really do think that this is just like government incompetence on the part of Puerto Rico. It's not anything that has to do with political parties in Puerto Rico. Like, they found a whole storage full of supplies that just weren't distributed in Ponce, which is terrible. People dying. There was a study by Harvard that found that 5,000 people died because of the hurricane. And it's extremely sad. It's extremely sad, and even in the light of these situations, people are still considering whether Puerto Rican statehood is not a factor. And I mean this from the United States. I've had conversations talking about how Puerto Rico should become a state, and they say, oh yeah, but you guys have massive debt. Wait a second.
But so does the United States.
Yeah. So does the U.S. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that's what the U.S. was founded on.
Yeah.
All the 13 colonies all assumed each other's debts and took on, and like the South was super opposed to that.
Right.
Like that was the whole point of founding.
One
the United
nation
States
under debt, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That was the thing in the committee about territories. Don't remember which committee exactly it was on. The House. That was the entire argument. Oh, Puerto Rico's ridden with debt, regardless of all the history behind our debt. The reason why we are indebted is because of the United States. This is actually this law that they passed called Section 936. This is terrible. It made Puerto Rico a tax haven. Tax haven. Corporations from the U.S. they came in and they didn't have to pay a single dime in tax.
So maybe Puerto Rico is also maybe that's why we don't want to allow Puerto Rico to become a state because we already have two Switzerlands. We've got four.
Another big argument for why Puerto Rico shouldn't become a state, at least from the Republican side, is that they do typically vote Democratic, trend Democratic.
No, well, yeah,
and
there's that too.
They have 3 million people in their state, so they'd have 4 or 5 representatives, which
we have 7. We have 7 districts right now.
Yeah.
So we would have the equivalent of.
But their population is the same as like an Iowa, which gives them a good bunch of electoral votes, and that would really swing the balance.
The same as Iowa.
Yeah, like Iowa, Nevada.
It's a flashback right now.
So like
that means Puerto Rico might also not know how to run a primary.
Oh no.
Well, Puerto Rico also holds caucuses. Actually,
we do.
Oh no.
We just use elections though. We don't use caucuses. Wait, we hold caucuses? Really?
Apparently you did in the past.
Oh my.
Yeah. But not anymore. It seems.
Wikipedia.
Hopefully not. Yeah, we don't want this to happen again.
But that's really interesting because I didn't think that all Puerto Ricans were monoliths, don't get me wrong, but I thought there was a little bit more consensus than you are explaining to us when it comes to Puerto Ricans' opinion on joining statehood.
Yeah.
So maybe can you explain for us sort of how that breaks down in terms of ideology? So what kind of maybe not party, but what ideology of people are pro statehood and what ideology is against joining the U.S.?
There's 2 big parties, obviously, Duverger's law. There's 2 big parties in Puerto Rico. We got Partido Popular Democrático, which is like the liberal party in this sense, and then we have el Partido Nuevo Progresista. Like it's gonna be very difficult to relay this in English, obviously.
So I heard PNP, liberals and I heard proletariat.
Yeah. So what do those 2 parties mean in English, if you wouldn't mind?
Okay, so it's the political party that stands for being a state. So let's just call it PNP, and then we have the political party that stands for the status quo, actually. And who would have thought that represent? See, it's extremely it's astonishing, and it's a very very powerful party in Puerto Rico. It's the PPD, actually. Let's just call it like that.
So the PPD is the status quo, and the
Yes.
PNP are the liberals.
Yes, and then we got the
Interesting.
PIP, who stands for independence.
Oh.
And independence is wrongfully associated with extremism, and it's often framed incorrectly. The only senator in our 27 Senate is Juan Dalmau, and he's an incredible human being. I went to Puerto Rico's Congress, and I actually talked about him, about the Puerto Rican relief. I live really nearby, so I would just walk by. You could submit legislation in a way
That's wild.
Yeah.
That's cool.
It was incredible.
Imagine a representative democracy that actually represents people.
Imagine.
I would have no idea what that's like.
Yeah, but this man is incredible, and he doesn't stand for too far ideals. He just believes that fundamentally Puerto Rico is a place that must be free within its own culture, and that it is possible to maintain a liberal democracy or a balance,
Or to
social
become
balance.
part.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So I know, kind of on that topic, in our conversations in the past, you called Puerto Rico a colony. So can you
Right.
can you indulge into that? Because its
course,
official
yeah.
title is obviously a territory.
Okay, so we were actually invaded, not necessarily invaded, but occupied by the U.S. July 4th. Okay. And on July 4th, many Puerto Ricans believed that this was the end of their democracy. They were granted autonomy, and then immediately they were stripped off this autonomy.
Mm.
In 1950, on July 4th, they were granted to write their own constitution. And historians often argue that this was an effort to shadow the invasion of the United States as something negative and turn it into the day we wrote our own constitution. So in this constitution, they said you can write whatever you want, just use the U.S. Constitution as a example. And the biggest thing was that you cannot mention Puerto Rico being a state or independent. You have to write Commonwealth. What does that entail? Well, then for them, it was colonial status. We don't have representation in Congress, but we still have to obey to their taxes. So I guess we have the same argument as Washington, D.C., and this correlates right to representation in general, like in this democracy. Like all of these people who have felt disenfranchised for the past 500 years. Like it just goes back to like Cristobal Colon, Christopher Columbus coming to Puerto Rico and enslaving the Arawakan tribe. Like this is something that has fueled a lot of passion, a lot of conversation in Puerto Rico, and I really do struggle to identify as a state or independent because our past is so full of just terrible situations. Actually, in 1930, we were part of an experiment where they used us to verify the viability of birth control, and they ended up making a lot of Puerto Rican women infertile. When they would give birth, these doctors would cut their fallopian tubes so they wouldn't give birth to more children. Puerto Rico's history is extremely dark. It's extremely, extremely dark. A lot of professors, if you go to any educational system in Puerto Rico, they're all independent. They all want independence because they know what has happened and they know how history goes. And they fear that there's going to be some type of obstruction of justice like there was in the past. And that's the big argument. Are we willing to neglect years of history and accept becoming a state into the very people who have experimented on us, who have exploited us economically, just to save some people from poverty? It's an extremely, extremely difficult decision to make as a Puerto Rican.
So I guess the pro-statehood camp, then, they are the main thrust of their argument. Is that all about
economics?
It's all an economic argument, whereas the pro-independence and maybe pro-status quo, which after that story sounds wild to me that the pro status quo party has any semblance of support at all. But they're all about protecting the culture and protecting Puerto Rico from history. Mark Twain or somebody once said history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes.
Basically,
Yeah, that's insane.
Yeah, there's one thing that actually really resonates to this. In 2016, that political party, they lost a lot of powers. You see, Puerto Rico has 27 senators, and they're all divided among districts except for 11. 11 are voted on through the entire nation, and then the remaining 16 are actually voted on by district. It's an extremely weird system. I don't entirely...
Iran's is kind of similar to that, if I remember correctly.
Yeah,
that's an odd
correct.
comparison.
I mean,
very far-fetched.
I'll
take your word for it.
Yeah.
Honestly, yeah. I just agreed to it. I didn't even...
it's an interesting system, but I don't know, it isn't a cool idea that like the Senate, it would be like, do you have two houses or is it just one house?
Yeah, we have a bicameral legislation. We have 47 House representatives and we have 27 senators.
Interesting.
Right. Yeah, so 6 of those senators are from the PPD, so they have lost a lot of support. And political scientists even say this last election was the death of this party. Regardless of that, they still have a lot of power when it comes to legislation, and they're able to sway. If you look at the records, the actual website for Congress was out for an entire year after the hurricane. I wasn't able to really research anything, and now they're passing laws that actually discourage investigative journalism, which is very scary, very scary. But then you're able to log in and see how legislators vote according to legislation. And
well, that's something.
Yeah, finally. I mean, it's been a year already. And the thing about it is that they agree on a lot of things, which just makes me wonder, like, whether they're actually voting for legislation to progress Puerto Rico or... Because, listen, all these senators, they have their chance. Like, they have their chance to ultimately push for statehood.
Yeah.
They have congressional approval. They have the power to launch plebiscites or referendums. They're just not doing it, which is slightly scaring me because I might think that this party has some type of like they've latched to the status quo and that they can keep exploiting Puerto Ricans ideologically and we are going to become a state.
And you said there was only one actual. So how many state people that support statehood are in Congress versus like the status quo and the independents?
Right. So our 27 seat Senate has a total of 20 senators from the PNP, so pro statehood. Then we have one who is for independence, and I got confused. It's not 6; it's 5 for PPD because we also have an independent called Vargas Vidot. Incredible man. I've met him myself. The guy shows up to Congress in like sneakers, polo t-shirt.
That's the kind of participation we need.
That's great.
Yeah, amazing guy. One person was talking about economics, and he's like, "Are we really gonna talk about economics?" He like students from the schools in Puerto Rico got the opportunity to watch Congress in action. Incredible opportunity, and you got to see him passionately speak about mental health in Puerto Rico, which is probably one of the biggest issues in like 4 out of our 7 districts.
Interesting. How's mental health the biggest issue? Because I mean, in the mainland U.S., you've got
Puerto Rico
people say you're voting on like healthcare, you're voting on like the economy. Mental health is not really been part of the equation. So how is that really big in Puerto Rico?
Okay, so Puerto Rico is going through a lot of. People say that it's because of just a lack of funding for institutions. My grandma, she's a psychologist, and she sees her patients all the time in the streets. They get caught, and then they're sent to the psychologist, and instead of receiving treatment or receiving any type of help, they're sent to jail. And they go out. It's just like a cyclical, like an institutional like method to take these people who have mental health, mental illness specifically, because obviously, there's a difference between poor mental health and poor mental illness. These people are mentally ill, not because of mental health. It's mentally ill. They either have bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, severe depression, borderline personality, and these are the issues at hand. Since we're not receiving a lot of funding for these institutions, or that the funding is guaranteed, but that the funding does not reach these bureaucratic levels. Like we see it all the time. Like all the $90 billion were allocated to Puerto Rico's government to help alleviate for hurricane relief. So the big question is, where did that money go?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of corruption in the Puerto Rican government?
Yes, for sure. There's a lot of shadowing on information. Investigative journalists are discouraged.
Yeah.
As I said, they're passing legislation on that. Our governor, this is very ironic, our current governor, Juan de Vasquez, actually talked to a CNN reporter instead of contacting local journalists. You're displaying information in English when the majority of your constituency is in Spanish. It doesn't make sense.
Now, what party was the governor a member of at the time?
Right. So currently, we have someone from the PNP, so pro statehood, and what actually happened was that in 2019, the summer of 2019, we discovered a chat right from our governor. We discovered a chat.
I remember that, yeah.
Yep. And in this chat, the governor was openly saying, one of his cabinet members in this chat said, "Man, I really want to hurt this legislator, for lack of better words, because I'm not going to say what they actually said." And the governor of Puerto Rico, elected democratically, said, "You'd be doing me a favor." That is despicable.
Yeah.
Apart from that, they were including a lot of public information about construction contracts when one of the lobbyists was in the chat.
Oh boy.
Elias Sanchez. It's a lot of dirt on this situation. And immediately, I love Puerto Rico. What I love about the people of Puerto Rico is that they're willing to be passionate about these situations, and they're not just going to sit idly by. I think it was more than 100,000 Puerto Ricans went to the Capitol one day after that scenario, and they went to protest and to say this is wrong, and we're not going to stand for this, and we're going to advocate for a change. And after a week, I went to 2 of those protests actually, and it's beautiful to see people from both parties, from the PNP and PPD, both there standing in unison against a corrupt government. And we stood and we protested until that man resigned. Ricardo Rosselló resigned, and the person who was next in line was a Department of Justice representative, because obviously the Secretary of State was in the chat, so he had to resign too.
Okay.
So we have our Department of Justice, who was under investigation from the FBI for 4 different charges, and now she's in power. Puerto Rico's system is entirely corrupt, and it's sad to say that actually today 4 representatives from the House, what's he called? Majority Leader.
House Majority. So Senate Majority Leader.
Yeah.
Mitch McConnell, or
no. For the House.
So House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy.
Yeah. No, the Majority Leader. Sorry, for the Democratic Party.
Nancy Pelosi.
Or
no, she's the Speaker of the House, and
Steny Hoyer.
Steny Hoyer, AOC, Nidia Velázquez, who is a rep from New York. Love her. She's incredible. They were all standing there. They were like, wow, the funding that we gave to Puerto Rico is not being put to good use. What is happening here? And you know what? The governor said she had a personal issue, and she didn't even show up to meet the congresswoman. And man, incredible.
It's really interesting how, as you've described this, it's almost as though that there's sometimes in some issues where you can look at Puerto Rico in a certain light and say it's very similar to the United States, but you can also take that same evidence and say it's actually very similar to an independent country in all of these things. And just to delve into the economics of it for a second, I mean, this is a little bit ridiculous here.
Right.
Puerto Ricans pay federal taxes. They pay. Let me just make sure I get this right. So Puerto Rico in 2016 paid $3.5 billion in taxes to the United States Treasury. Residents of Puerto Rico pay into Social Security and are eligible for Social Security. but they are excluded from supplemental security income, which is basically an extra little part of Social Security, but it's not the main part. They pay import and export taxes, commodity taxes, and they pay payroll taxes and Medicare, but they don't get.
We don't. Yeah. And one of the biggest things, we actually have this thing called the Jones Act. Pretty,
Usually when acts like that are named after generic white names, they never end well. Like you've got the Dickey Amendment.
You're right. You're perfectly right. This act essentially doesn't let Puerto Rico trade with other nations.
Ugh.
Yeah.
Well, that's like also, I mean, for states they can't do that. So like that kind of makes sense. But also when you're not given the rights of the state, it really disadvantages you.
Yeah. The thing is that after the hurricane, this really impacted the people because we couldn't receive. And people can also import things. They have to first import it into the United States and then into Puerto Rico. Mm-hmm. So
if you, for example, sorry to,
right.
I just,
go ahead.
Because I'm really curious about this.
Yeah.
If you're coming, let's say, from England, and you fly from England to Puerto Rico,
right? Yeah.
And you have goods to declare.
Yeah.
You can't declare those goods. You have to fly first to Florida, and then declare them in Florida, and then go to Puerto Rico.
It's mainly if you're going to send goods to Puerto Rico, like you can go to Puerto Rico and then.
Okay.
But like if you have like stuff you want to sell there, if you're like a merchant.
Yeah, you can sell things there. But if you're a merchant that's established in somewhere that is not the United States, well, then first you have to send your items to the United States for then.
Wait, but then why would you ever send them to Puerto Rico? That's just stifling business.
Exactly. Tariffs are so high because then you have to pay different tariffs.
It's not even a tariff. It's like it's an informal tariff because you have an extra stop on the supply chain.
Right. So businesses are not encouraged to actually promote trade in Puerto Rico. So
that makes sense.
Right. Yeah. With all reason, I completely understand it. But then again, it's just due to poor legislation that has been.
Poor legislation, a lack of leverage, a lack of unity and corruption, which gives sort of fuel to the fire of we can't let Puerto Rico in as a state. Look how corrupt they are.
Yeah, exactly. That's. I'm sorry, but I'm gonna name drop here. That's what Trump does. Like right now, he's saying, "Oh, Puerto Rico is the most corrupt place on earth." Listen, I had to read the Democratic platform, the DNC's platform and the RNC's platform, and in both cases they mention Puerto Rico. The difference is that the DNC says we want Puerto Rico to choose for their own, and we're going to let them make the decision. Meanwhile, the RNC actually says we're going to make Puerto Rico a state once we get power.
So do you support the right of self-determination then for Puerto Rico? I
have to. It's just something that it's foundational to democracy.
If they're given that vote, you think that they would still vote to become a state?
I think so, because if you look at it like on the representation aspect, if you see all these PNP senators winning in Congress, regardless of obviously being somewhat sketchy and being labeled corrupt, regardless of it, they're still winning. They're still winning, and that's very representative of what the people of Puerto Rico want, regardless of the history of Puerto Rico. And one of the things about the current plebiscites by the PNP is that the PPD, because they know they don't want to, obviously, because if Puerto Rico becomes a state, what's the point of the PPD? Representing what status quo.
Yeah.
Right? So we're looking at a situation where if the PPD loses in getting its ultimate goal and the PNP succeeds, the PPD is irrelevant and it will undoubtedly cease to exist. What are they going to advocate for? Oh, we need regression. We need to go back to being a colony. Really? You think you're going to mobilize? Really? So
that sounds like a message that'll get some passionate supporters. This is, I'll tell you
maybe
what, though.
California, maybe.
This fits into kind of a larger narrative though, because I mean, we haven't really mentioned the global narrative before on this show yet, but 2016 was I'm a big believer that Trump is not an anomaly.
No, not at all.
You have people all over the world, whether they're in well, whether it's Brexiteers, whether it's people electing Duterte in the Philippines, you have
Right.
everybody rebelling against the status quo everywhere except
Mhm.
really in France, but whatever.
Le Pen almost won. I mean,
Yeah, Le Pen almost
she,
won.
she was number 2, so like.
So
yeah.
Right.
you have people everywhere rebelling against the status quo.
Yeah, and the
Rebelling
rise of
against
populism.
globalization.
Poland too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
You got the and you have left wing variants and you have right wing variants.
Very true.
But it's all about rebelling against the status quo.
Right.
The Social Democrats in Germany going down. I guess as you said, the party supporting the status quo in Puerto Rico going
Right.
down.
And
The Clinton Democrats going down.
Yeah.
And then also just in like even in Scandinavia, you saw
Yeah.
the right wing parties in Scandinavia, which are the ones that want to lower the tax rate to
Yeah,
70%.
yeah.
So,
Those free marketeers with their
Yeah.
70% taxes.
But speaking of the international perspective, so the reason we know Rafael actually is through
Yeah.
Model UI at Duquesne.
Oh yeah.
And actually, recently Puerto Rico is kind of in a topic in the Special Committee on Decolonization.
Yeah.
Yes, they are.
Because spec poll
Yes, they
is almost completely resolved because there are very few colonies, but
Right.
Almost.
they've talked about how Puerto Rico has a colonial relationship with the United States,
Mhm.
and they refer to Puerto Rico as either a nation or a colony in all their reports. So it's interesting to see that international perspective come through also on the side of
Yeah, like
not the status quo, I guess.
exactly. It's extremely interesting to see these these international bodies even recognize Puerto Rico as being a colony because basic 101 history in schools in Puerto Rico is we are a commonwealth, an estado libre asociado.
Yeah,
Right.
Pennsylvania is a commonwealth.
Yeah.
So like,
It doesn't make sense.
no.
It doesn't. And one of the things that's actually very interesting is that the people who crafted the Puerto Rican Constitution, this is a hot take, but I think they were coerced. So actually, our first elected governor, Luis Muñoz Marin,
Mhm.
incredible person. He stood for independence for over 20 years. And then in 1950, right before they got to write their constitution, this general comes into Puerto Rico and he has a meeting with him. And then out of nowhere, he has a press conference. And the governor says, I no longer stand for independence. I want to be a commonwealth. And this is very symbolic. When you see the Puerto Rican flag, where the blue, right, we got the star, we got the stripes, we got the blue surrounding the star.
Looks kind of like the Texan flag a little bit.
Right, yeah. Very similar. I've thought of that too, or the Chilean flag, yeah. And then the thing is that the shade of blue is darker. And people think that that's representative of a change in ideology, a change in hope. We first stood for independence and we stood for justice. And then after this certain meeting, the flag's colors changed. And then the entire ideology of a political party is realigned. Conveniently, right?
Yeah.
So extremely fishy things happen in Puerto
So
Rico.
that constitution that you've mentioned, did they have a constitution before that?
No.
Okay, so they were just like there, and the U.S. just kind of owned
Right.
them. That was the thing.
Yeah, so we were ruled under this Jones Act, which establishes some precepts for Puerto Rican legislation. The Jones Act isn't entirely bad, apart from it, having some impact on acre limits. So for farming, agriculture was incredibly big for Puerto Rico throughout the 19th century. So once the U.S. actually occupied Puerto Rico in the 20th century, agriculture was actually ignored in this operation that the U.S. had called Operation Bootstrap, right? They wanted to make Puerto Rico industrialized. They wanted to change its entire infrastructure. And in the process, they felt that it was necessary to redistribute all the acres of Puerto Rico equally among Puerto Ricans in this thing called Pan, Tierra y Libertad, which its roots are actually from democratic socialist.
Yeah,
So
it sounds like a Lazaro, a former Mexican president. Sounds like a Lazaro Cardenas kind of thing.
Yep,
Founder
exactly.
of PRI, I believe.
It's very, very interesting to see all this because Luis Muñoz Marin arguably was a democratic socialist, right? So his policy was implemented. However, the thing about this was that the land wasn't uniquely distributed. A lot of corporations from the U.S. received way more acres.
But Rafael, you're missing the point because corporations are people too.
Right, yes. They deserve a right to speak.
I'm looking at a graph
Corporations.
here also. And it looks like they gained almost 100,000 industrial jobs
Oh wow.
from Operation Bootstrap, but you lost 150,000 plus agricultural jobs. So, you know.
Yeah.
Well, it begs the question: what kind of jobs are worth more? Are you looking at
Right.
sort of second tier jobs, or those
Right.
There's 75,000.
first tranche, if you will?
Not even looking at the pay, it's a 75,000 job pay gap, or a $75,000 or 75,000 job loss, which is insane.
Yeah, and then one of the things that's very unique is that our first, we went under military rule once we were occupied by the U.S. for about 4 years, and during those 4 years, one of the provisional governors was a general. I don't remember his name. It's a very generic American name. I'm extremely sorry. But he actually took a lot of the land from Puerto Rico, and you know what he created?
A military base?
No.
Ah.
He
What?
created Domino's Sugar. With all that land, he created a company that is like extremely well known.
Yeah.
Like one of two sugar companies that
Uh-huh.
sort of corners the market.
Like that,
Yes.
like sugar in the raws.
Yeah.
Is sweetened though, even sugar? I don't know. But
I don't know.
Maybe.
Same idea. Yeah.
Yeah, so Domino's Sugar was actually founded on economic exploitation and stripping Puerto Ricans of their land.
Can I just
Incredible.
say, I thought when you said Domino's, I thought you might be talking about Domino's Pizza. Domino's Pizza was founded
They
on economic
built-
exploitation.
In 1907, they built over 20 Domino's pizzerias all throughout Puerto Rico. It was the end of it.
We should not be laughing about this as much
We
as we
shouldn't.
are.
We
It's
shouldn't.
really messed up.
It's extremely messed up, and it's terrible. I mean, you guys, everyone should look up this man. This is an incredible man. I think he's comparable to B.S. Ambedkar from India. This is an incredible person who fought for Puerto Rican independence. He was actually a devout Catholic too. His name was Pedro Albizus Campos. He was a man who grew up in Puerto Rico, and he was so smart. He went on to the U.S. To study in the University of Vermont, transferred first year to Harvard University, graduated valedictorian of his class, and graduated from its law school top of his class again. He never gave his valedictorian speech because most of his professors would not allow a Puerto Rican to give a graduation speech.
What year was this? 1928?
Yes, around that area.
Jeez.
Yeah.
Wow.
Extremely regressive.
Puerto Rican discrimination against Puerto Ricans is kind of swept. I mean, discrimination against
Right.
all people is swept under the rug, but I mean that
Yes.
really.
There's a very also acute discrimination of Puerto Ricans that comes just from like not knowing anything about Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
So, like people saying that Sonia Sotomayor is the first ever immigrant Supreme Court justice we've ever had.
Oh come on.
I've gone
yeah,
that way
her
before.
family.
I've
her
actually
family
gone that way
immigrated
before.
over here from Puerto Rico.
Like also Puerto Ricans are legally speaking American citizens.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, I've had people say, like one time, I had these friends who were they entered a dorm, and then this guy he said, "Wait, I've never been in a room with 3 Mexicans before."
Oh man.
I just gotta disclaim it right here. I'm a Trump supporter. I hope that doesn't bother any of you guys. And it's just like, what? What are you saying? And I had this dispute over laundry, and this guy says, I don't know how you do it in your country.
Oh boy.
I'm like, oh,
Oh boy.
my country. Okay. I see how it is. I laugh because it's defense mechanism. I'm afraid of everything. So
No.
I laugh.
Well,
I'm kidding. But the guy, oof.
I mean,
I can't believe that, though.
the precedent is there.
Yeah. So if we could just for a few minutes before we wrap up touch on the election a little bit. So
Right, yeah.
since that
Interesting.
is kind of like our podcast.
Kind of deviated a little bit.
Now that we have a good idea of like the history around Puerto Rico, let's spend some
Right,
time
yeah.
just like talking about the electoral history of Puerto Rico. So
Of course.
Puerto Rico didn't have any primaries until 2008. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So and when we take it over to 19,
When did we take it over?
what, 1800? It was after the Spanish American War, right?
Yeah,
So it was,
okay, so
1898.
1898, yeah.
So, you know,
Yeah.
110 years later, we finally let them have a say in anything.
Eventually, maybe. Maybe a little bit more.
And so the results.
Right. Yeah.
Hillary won in 2008 and in 2016.
Yes.
But if you look at the vote total, the turnout was 388,000 in 2008 and 88,000.
Where did 300,000 people go?
Do you know at all? Just like intuition, Rafael. At all?
I don't know. I have to be honest. I don't know where the came from.
Yeah.
I bet 300,000 people left the country.
I mean,
no.
In fairness, though,
The country.
The Republican 2008 Puerto Rico caucuses had 208 voters.
Wow. Yeah, Puerto Rico is pretty democratic.
Yeah.
And even, listen, my parents they're from the PNP. They're big advocates for statehood, but they are Democrats. So there's this misconception about the PNP being extremely conservative. And I feel like it's a bad alignment with conservatism and statehood. And it's bad, but at the same time, we're making some type of progress when individuals are becoming, like I have a bunch, this is really sad to say, but I have a bunch of friends who are for statehood. They're Democrats. You know who they're going to vote for? Michael Bloomberg. Yes.
So this is
Really?
this brings us to kind of an interesting point because I mean, so Hillary wins Puerto Rico both times.
Yes.
Wild scene. And so you've got a lot of friends who are supportive of Bloomberg. That's really interesting. So
I really don't know how this is going to be a very interesting primary. Very interesting. Because in Puerto Rico, you have our front runner for governor, Pedro Pierluisi, who was actually the guy who brought forward that referendum for statehood that had 66% saying they want to become a state. And this guy openly endorsed Michael Bloomberg. So you have a lot of people saying, so this guy, I know this guy, and he says that Michael Bloomberg's great. Boom, I'm going for him.
Interesting.
We also have a high population of people from Dominican Republic as well as Cuba, right? So these people are never going to vote for Bernard Sanders.
Yeah, because there's a history of socialism there. Even this is the difference, but
yeah. However,
so that turns them away from Bernie.
Right. Yeah.
Interesting.
But since that's more evident in states like Florida, right? Because there's way more Cubans in Florida. However, in Puerto Rico, a lot of people are edging towards Bernie, especially with this big generation, this big movement, this big movement of people who are now eligible to vote are saying, I kind of really like Bernie Sanders and how he wants to take over things.
And do you know, if I'm not aware of Bernie's, if he has one policy on Puerto Rico, is it any different than the Democratic establishment?
Yes. So I actually had to, because if I'm going to support a Democratic candidate, I'm obviously going to look at their platforms and say who's actually going to represent me.
Imagine researching a candidate's policies.
Yes. God forbid, So I went into Yang's platform, Rip Yang. He actually had Puerto Rico make Puerto Rico a state, make Puerto Rico the 51st state of the U.S. I mean 52nd, 51st.
51st, yeah.
51st. Sorry.
And he's already counting D.C. It's fine.
Yeah, I'm already counting D.C. So then you have Michael Bloomberg, who has also Puerto Rico becoming a state. And then you have the rest of the candidates. Bernie actually does have a policy to establish a referendum, and then for Puerto Ricans to decide. Amy Klobuchar does not mention it even once. Pete Buttigieg, I haven't really researched his platform. I'm guessing he probably has some type of order to establish a referendum. In the past, Cory Booker, nothing. I don't know why I even mentioned Cory Booker.
He's been out for a while now.
Yeah, Julian Castro, he actually had one. Julian Castro had to establish a referendum. Rightfully so, right? He's Hispanic. He knows his constituency.
Did Julian Castro have a lot of support in the early going?
See, the thing about Puerto Rican voters is that they don't pay attention to a lot of current events.
Sounds like American voters.
Yeah. So if they recognize a Hispanic name in a ballot, they're going to vote for it. Okay, so in 2008, Puerto Ricans actually voted Rocky de la Fuente third, which is hilarious. Never heard of that man.
Yeah, he runs every 4 years as a Republican dark horse candidate, and has about the same odds of winning as like
Vermin Supreme.
So, you know,
Why were you guys in instinct in saying Vermin Supreme?
he's kind of a joke of a candidate, but
What are you talking about? He's amazing.
he is amazing. But
I don't know who he is, but he has my vote.
yeah, another very interesting thing that makes Puerto Rico different in the electoral scene is that DC, which is the most comparable situation, I guess, to Puerto Rico, gets to vote in presidential general elections. They get their three electoral votes that they would have otherwise. But Puerto Rico doesn't, even though they should be getting like 6 or 7 electoral votes. Instead, they get absolutely nothing.
Possibly could have made. How long? I think what was the? Because obviously we're fond Hillary Clinton supporters. Did not even know that. Like I was looking at the past primaries in Puerto Rico, and I was like, Hillary Clinton over Obama?
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, extremely interesting. I was like, wow, this is incredible. I didn't know there was such a stable foundation of Hillary supporters in Puerto Rico. But how long was the loss? Hillary Clinton's electoral
Hillary lost by
college?
like 70 votes, so it wouldn't have
It
actually
would've made a
changed it. But
difference. It's still something.
Yeah.
Some type of, not even momentum. I mean, it's as good as it gets. Probably would have won the popular vote victory.
Even more.
Yeah.
Even more.
Yeah. Get an extra $3 million on there. So.
In theory.
Yeah. But it's interesting.
Definitely. Yeah. One of the interesting things about our referendums, though, is that this one in 2013, the big controversy was the turnout rate. Okay, so I mentioned this statistic a few times, but the thing about the turnout rate, it was extremely low. Now, this has happened in a lot of the past referendums, and it's obviously a problem, and it's mainly because the PPD actually says to their constituents, do not go and take this referendum. They boycott it.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so then is it invalid or?
Sadly, yes. It has to be, not disproportionately, but it's 13% of Puerto Ricans actually voted in those referendums.
So it's like not actually enough to say they want this.
It's really sad because I want a straight answer. I want to know what Puerto Ricans want. And there's actually like some polls out there, but then again, like politics gets so in the midst of it that we don't even focus on the very foundation of these political parties at this time. And actually, this rise of this, it's arguable that in 2016, the election was won by the Conservative Party because there was a third party that got a lot of votes. This woman called Alexandra Lugaro. She's also a very progressive candidate. I think comparable to Bernard Sanders, possibly. There were also a lot of independent candidates that factionalized the votes and took away a lot of the votes from the Liberal Party, which massively impacted the elections. And they're coming back in 2020. So who knows? Maybe this is going to be a PNP-dominated era just because there's a lot of fractionalization on the opposite lane. Hopefully there's some type of coordination, like Bernard Sanders running as a Democrat. But from what it looks like, she's not budging on that. And she created her own political party called Victoria Ciudadana. Very interesting to see. This is going to be one of the most consequential, interesting elections in Puerto Rican history.
And it's going to be worth following because as it happens, it'll impact, perhaps if she's as dynamic a candidate and creates as dynamic a party as it sounds, it might actually have an impact on, create a potential situation for the rest of the country.
Yeah,
but
she stands for independence actually, which is really interesting. But then she's like, she wants to have trade relationships with the United States, and then sort of diverge into independence. It's an interesting policy, but who knows, right?
It's going to be what it's going to be.
Yeah,
and hopefully we'll see more news about that coming up. But it is just about time to wrap up our episode for this evening.
Awesome. And thank you for listening to our first ever student discussion series. Rafael, you've been a wonderful guest. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for coming in.
I appreciate the opportunity.
Our intro and outro music is by Paul Abrams and Rock Solid Panda, produced by Elise Duda, and our signal monitor is James Walsh.
You can find a recording of this podcast and any of our other ones on our YouTube channel, Catch 52, and also make sure to follow us on our Facebook, our Twitter, and stay updated on all of our airtime, episode topics, and upcoming guests.
We welcome your comments, your feedback, and suggestions.
And
Have a great Friday and a great weekend.
Stick with us.